Hello everyone. Welcome to our English conversation program. This is Katsuaki Togo
and Win Aubrey,
inviting you to join us for the guest hour.
The guest for this month is Mr. Hisaaki Yamanuchi, Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Tokyo.
We hope you will enjoy being with us for the next 15 minutes. Well, Mr. Yamanouchi, it's very nice of you to come to talk to us today.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
May I just start off by asking what motivated you to read English studies at Tokyo University?
Before entering university, I had made up my mind to read English or one or another of modern European languages. Familiarity with English for a longer period of time was one of the factors that made me choose it rather than any other European language for the special subject of my study. At the university, there were two options for me to choose: whether to go to the Faculty of Literature, where one could study English literature in its own right, or to go to the Faculty of Liberal Arts, where one could study it in conjunction with other disciplines, namely British history, politics, economy, history of ideas, etc. I think I was right in choosing the latter, for English literature should be studied as part and parcel of English culture as an entirety. To me, at least, that is the implication of English studies.
Now, your first studies abroad were at Columbia University in the United States, and after that you went on to Canada. On what programs did you go there?
As a student of English literature, I meant to go and study in England, but in the early 1960s, there were more opportunities for us to go and study in the United States. I was lucky to be awarded a postgraduate fellowship to study at Columbia University in New York City, where I took my master's degree in English literature.
And of course, in order to study abroad, you have to have a very good command of English. Where and how did you obtain this good command of English prior to your first visit abroad?
I had some command of English when I went to the United States and Canada, but it was far from adequate, especially for the purpose of expressing myself in either spoken or written English. This fact, however, should not prevent me from saying that perhaps I was one of the luckiest people who were taught English by a number of really good teachers. I had a good start down in Hiroshima, where I received my secondary as well as my primary education. Many of the teachers of English at my school were highly qualified and later became university lecturers. In those days, there was no native speaker of English at my school. At the university, I had the luck of being taught English literature by a young and inspiring English lecturer fresh from Oxford. This was Anthony Thwaite, who is now in his late 40s and has by now published several volumes of his poems.
So, you studied in America and Canada, and then you spent 8 years or so in England at Cambridge University. You know, I'm wondering, how do they compare in terms of their academic freedom and environments?
I think it is important as well as interesting to note and compare the differences in the university education in America, Canada, and England. I think as far as the undergraduate education is concerned, American college or university aims at producing, by means of general or liberal arts education, an all-round man or woman rather than a specialist. It is in the graduate school and other postgraduate institutions such as law school, school of business, school of journalism, etc., that professional or specialist training is given. There is also a larger intake of university entrants in the United States. For a long time in Britain, on the other hand, there were fewer universities, and in fact, until the 19th century, there had been no university other than Oxford and Cambridge, apart from Scottish universities. The idea of university education has been more elitist in comparison with the United States. General education of American type should have more or less finished at school level, and 3 years of university education is devoted to specific disciplines. Thus, by the end of 3 years, a student attains to a higher level of academic discipline, although he is not necessarily a specialist. The essence of English education from school to university level is to provide an environment in which an individual could develop his or her interest and ability. For a tutorial or supervision, for instance, a student prepares a weekly essay and reads it in front of his or her supervisor, followed by a long discussion. By this person-to-person, two-way process, a student learns how to think and express himself or herself logically and intelligently. As for the Canadian system, I can safely say that it is a mixture of both American and British ways.
Well, I understand that you've been to Canada, and could I ask what brought you there?
There was a very special and important reason for my crossing the Canadian border. I had for some time taken an interest in Samuel Taylor Coleridge, an English poet who was active in the late 18th and early 19th century. I came to know the name of a Canadian scholar, Catherine Cockburn, who was then making a really remarkable achievement in Coleridge studies. For decades, with a few exceptions, English scholars had rather neglected Coleridge, perhaps partly because his personal life was erratic, his works were fragmentary, or at least were considered so, and their content very abstruse. What Professor Cockburn did was first to discover some hitherto unknown Coleridge manuscripts, to edit them, and to give an integrated and comprehensive picture of Coleridge, who was not only a poet and critic, as he was once recognized, but also made important contribution in varied fields such as philosophy, psychology, religion, politics, and so on. I had another luck of being awarded a Canada UNESCO Fellowship that enabled me to have a year at the University of Toronto, where Professor Cockburn was teaching. Half of the year, another half she used to be in England to do her research on Coleridge. I could spend hours to talk about Professor Cockburn, but let me simply say how magnanimous she was in having me, a mere novice, who dared turn up out of blue in front of such a distinguished scholar. All in all, 2 years in North America helped me immensely to get along when I later went to England.
But after studying in these countries, you're now back in Japan, and I understand that you teach at Tokyo University. I wonder what sort of courses you teach and how your students are coming along now.
Most of the time, I teach English to the first and second year students. I'm afraid I cannot be very inventive in the ways I teach, partly because the number of students in one class is often too large, amounting to 60 or even 70. I also do a bit of help with teaching a much smaller number of third and fourth year students specializing in English studies.
And with your good command of English, I wonder if you lecture in English or in Japanese.
Well, at my main place of work, I normally teach in Japanese, in the nature of what I teach, and for the size of the classes. It just happens to be easier that way. However, at some other institution where I teach part-time and give a survey course on English literature of a particular period, I lecture in English.
Mr. Yamanouchi, you seem to have started off with English studies and to have ended with your highest degree in English literature. What aspect of English literature do you think attracted you most to do your postgraduate work?
Practically any English author and any aspect of English culture interests me, but I cannot pretend that I have read everything I ought to. So let me make a distinction between my general and special interest. As for the latter, I have been engaged in research on the late 18th and early 19th century English poets, including Coleridge. At the risk of oversimplification, I may describe one of the characteristic features of these poets as the infinite expansion of imaginative power to such an extent that their imaginative vision came to conflict with external reality, in extreme cases bordering on insanity and mental breakdowns. Along these lines, I wrote my Cambridge dissertation.
And I suspect that you've been to some places of literary interest when you were in England. And did you do some traveling?
Yes, I had an Austin minicar with which I explored quite a lot of the English countryside. Of course, I love the English Lake District and part of the West Country.
Yes, it's very beautiful. That part of England is extremely beautiful. What else did you do in England beside your own studies?
Well, originally I was a British Council scholar in 1967 to do research in English literature at Cambridge. And I was trying to extend my stay by applying for the extension of my scholarship for the following year, just when I was quite unexpectedly asked whether I was ever interested in teaching Japanese in the Faculty of Oriental Studies in the University of Cambridge. Of course, I had no hesitation in accepting the offer, because it was to enable me to stay on in Cambridge for another year at least, and possibly longer.
And did you find that when you were teaching Japanese as a language, you found your own identity, so to speak, in a foreign land?
That's very true. I must confess I was going through a phase of some kind of identity crisis, if I may say so, and I was finding myself not really assimilated into the hard core of the ancient seat of learning, while geographically separated and daily getting alienated from my own country. So to continue research in English literature, while at the same time teaching my own language and literature, this was perhaps one of the possible ways of coping with such a crisis.
Yes. Did you find it easy to visit the English people's homes, for example? I know in Japan, usually the form of entertainment is to go out to a restaurant or something, but in England people invite you to their homes. Did you find this happened a lot with you?
Yes, I found the Cambridge academics quite hospitable, and I enjoyed going to parties given by my colleagues and my senior colleagues and my supervisor, etc.
Oh, that's very nice, Mr. Yamanouchi, but that's just the time we have today, and would you mind coming over once again to talk to us next week?
I shall be happy to come back.
Well, Win, we have to close the program by saying thank you very much once again for being with us, Professor Yamanouchi.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our English conversation program. This is Katsuaki Togo
And Win Aubrey.
inviting you to join us for the guest hour.
Today we will continue our discussion with Mr. Yamanouchi, Associate Professor of English at the University of Tokyo, who is the guest for this month.
Okay, let's have fun listening to him.
Thank you so much for coming again.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to be back.
So today is your second visit to us, Mr. Yamanouchi. For the benefit of those who weren't able to be with us last week, you've told us so far about your studies in America, Canada, and England, and given us a most interesting comparison of the academic atmospheres of these countries. You also mentioned that you were able to do some teaching of the Japanese language in England. What was the most difficult aspect of teaching Japanese and Japanese literature to English students?
It used to be customary to describe the Japanese language as illogical and English as logical. If that was true, the difficulty of teaching Japanese to English students might be described as one of teaching an illogical language to someone used to a logical language. However, the apparently illogical Japanese has its own logic, and apparently logical English has a number of illogical elements in it. So the old myth of logical English and illogical Japanese must collapse. Then what about literature? Here again, the old myth had it that traditional Japanese literature resorted to the implicit and ineffable rather than to the explicit. Nonetheless, it is now well known that there are at least 7 types of ambiguity, a lot of ironies and paradoxes, etc. in English literature. The difficulty of teaching Japanese and Japanese literature to English students is not a matter of teaching the illogical and implicit to someone with a logical and explicit frame of mind. Rather, it is the difficulty of teaching consciously and theoretically what we have instinctively and intuitively taken for granted.
How do the English students studying Japanese differ from the Japanese students studying English in terms of their motivation, objective and basic approach to the study?
I think I had better begin by explaining the background against which English studies in this country and Japanese studies in England have developed. English literature is an important element in European culture to which Japan has looked up since she opened the country to the West in the middle of the 19th century. No wonder the Department of English Literature at major universities in this country takes as many students as those in the Japanese department. The balance is entirely different in England. At Cambridge, for instance, as many as 300 students read English studies each year. English studies, together with classics and history, constitute the nucleus of humanistic disciplines. University graduates in English literature do not necessarily pursue their subjects of study in their career, but they put to good use what they have learned from English studies while they play important roles in all spheres of English culture. As for Japanese studies, there are extremely high-powered specialists. There is no denying, however, that in quantity at least, Japanese studies cannot be but marginal, having about 5 students on average each year. The academic standard of specialists is one thing, and the status in the academic hierarchy is another. Part of the reasons why the academic standard of English scholars of Japanese studies is so high is that many of them were talented future academics in some other disciplines, such as philosophy, classics, and modern languages, who were converted to Japanese studies during the Second World War. They would have made their career in other fields of academic study. Now the motivation of students who read Japanese at university. It varies quite a lot. In one way or another, some of them have had either first-hand or second-hand contact with Japanese and Oriental culture and have taken a genuine interest in it. In other cases, the motivation can be rather negative. Some of them might say that they are fed up with Latin and Greek, which they have studied for years at school, and have thus turned to Japanese. The allegedly best student who has read Japanese at Cambridge was originally a law student. He had an accident owing to a gas explosion in his college room, which made him turn to a subject farthest removed from his original subject of study. There are 4 British universities where Japanese is acknowledged as an academic discipline in its own right. At 3 of these, namely the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, Oxford, and Cambridge, the basic approach to the subject is almost the same. At these places, the students follow the course of study that integrates the Japanese language, Japanese history, and Japanese literature, both modern and classical. At Sheffield, they concentrate only on the study of modern Japan. There, the students combine Japanese studies with one of the disciplines in social sciences, such as politics and economy.
You've just pointed out very interesting differences between the students of Japanese and the students of English. But I wonder, what is it that really makes the two countries then different? As it is very often said that Japan has a lot of things in common with the United Kingdom, of Great Britain, of course, I mean that. So what do you think about this point?
I may be simply giving a hackneyed and stereotyped image. In England, an individual is encouraged to go his or her own way, doing as well as saying whatever he or she likes. In Japan, on the other hand, an individual is trained from school to social institutions in how to behave in accordance with the code of a group to which he or she belongs. This behavior of an individual seems also to be reflected on that of a nation as a whole. The British people do not care less about what others think of them. On the other hand, foreigners' views of Japan are translated into Japanese and sell extremely well, while there is no similar phenomenon in Britain.
And then the question comes up, how do you think cultural exchange between two countries should be in the future, or how should it be promoted?
The mode of cultural exchange differs from one field to another. Needless to say, exchange means a two-way process. In scientific and technical fields, exchange has been and will be carried on successfully. Difficulties will remain with other fields. In language teaching, tremendous contribution has been recently made by the so-called Woofers scheme. This is, of course, a one-way process. The greatest difficulty will remain with the study of literature. A nagging question has been on my mind for years. How could a Japanese student read the same amount of English literature and write their critical appreciations with the same ease as English students do? It will be when we can answer this question with more confidence that we could envisage a fruitful two-way process of exchange between England and Japan. Until then, there seems to be a lot to be done to consolidating the study of English literature in this country.
And what are some of the most important things do you think Japan can learn from England, either culturally or academically or even socially, politically?
The English culture is so subtle in every sense of the word that I find myself at a loss how to give a comprehensive and coherent answer to this question. My answer will be simply to give a series of aphoristic observations. For instance, first, conservation of whatever is valuable, whether historical monuments or natural scenery, as typically exemplified by the National Trust. And secondly, may I refer to the habit of free debate in which minority opinion can be expressed. And thirdly, perhaps if I may put the matter in a larger context, priority goes to quality rather than to quantity. And finally, to talk about education, the tutorial or supervision system, which is based on the person-to-person relationship between the supervisor and the pupil. These are some of the things I think we could learn from.
You know, it's often said that you have to go outside your own country for a while in order to appreciate it. I know I certainly had to do this with England. I wonder, do you agree with this?
I certainly do. If I may talk about my own experience, I mentioned earlier the identity crisis I underwent while living in England. However long I lived in England, I was never English and still always Japanese. I was living completely isolated from the realities of daily life in Japan, while I became more and more aware of the heritage of traditional Japanese culture with which I had been brought up. In other words, I remained Japanese more and more in spirit and less in body. Perhaps this was at once a disadvantage and an advantage. I didn't have to worry about the newspaper reports on robberies, murders, fires daily happening in Japan. All that I had to do was to know essential facts about Japan in the abstract. For example, the spectacular economic growth, the developing and reshaping of the Japanese archipelago, etc. Without knowing it, I was looking at my own country from outside, as I would never have done if I had been living here all the time. The shock was really great when I did 3 weeks homecoming at Christmas 1973, soon after the oil crisis. After 6 years' absence, I found myself a stranger in the middle of the material prosperity of Tokyo. I could not believe my own eyes when I saw out of the window of the super express train Hikari rows and rows of newly built houses corroding the rural scenery. The shock was all the greater because I had just flown over from the land of green in mere 17 hours by a jet. I had left my heart in the English countryside, although I was never really a part of it. I must hasten to add, however, that this brief homecoming served as a preliminary exercise for my ultimate return to this country in the spring of 1976.
Well, Wen, I really wish we had more time, but that's all the time we have. And let us thank you, Professor Yamanouchi, for being with us again. And I certainly hope our listeners enjoyed being with us as well. And let me conclude this program by saying goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
担当は東後勝明先生。お相手はウィン・オーブリーさん。ゲストは山内久明先生でした。英語会話を終わります。